June 1st, 1991. Shortly before 3 in the morning, a gray stretch limousine pulled up to the emergency room entrance at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Inside the back seat, a tall, gaunt man lay slumped and unconscious. No wallet, no identification. $53 in his pockets. He was pronounced dead within the hour and tagged as a John Doe. It took the FBI running his fingerprints to confirm what should have been obvious to anyone who ever loved soul music. The dead man was David Ruffin, the voice of my girl. Marvin Gaye once said of him, "I heard in his voice a strength my own voice lacked." So how does one of the greatest voices in American music die anonymous on a hospital gurney? Where did the $40,000 he was carrying that night disappear? Who left him at that emergency room door and drove away? The answers involve crack houses, borrowed limousines, and a music industry that celebrated black genius while ignoring black pain. There is a place in rural Mississippi called Whynot. No one is entirely sure how it got the name, though the locals have their theories. It sits about 15 miles outside Meridian in Lauderdale County, deep in the South, where sharecropping sustained black families and Jim Crow laws kept them in place. It was here on January 18, 1941, that Davis Eli Ruffin was born into a world that offered him almost nothing and demanded almost everything. His father, Eli Ruffin, was a Baptist minister. Strict does not begin to describe him. According to multiple accounts, including those from family members and biographers, Eli was violently abusive. He worked odd jobs hauling lumber when he was not preaching, and he ran his household the way he ran his congregation, with absolute authority and zero tolerance for disobedience. David's mother, Ophelia, died from complications of childbirth just 10 months after he was born. He never knew her. The absence shaped him in ways he would spend a lifetime trying to articulate and never quite managing. Eli remarried in 1942 to a schoolteacher named Erlene Johnson. By most accounts, she was a stabilizing presence, but the household remained poor and rigid. The family at times lived in a home with no running water. David was the third of 4 children alongside his older brothers Quincy and Jimmy and his sister Rita Mae. There was another sister, Rosine, who died in infancy. Death had a way of visiting the Ruffin family early and often. What the family did have was music. Eli organized his children into a gospel group, and they traveled across the South, performing in churches, opening for acts like Mahalia Jackson and the 5 Blind Boys of Mississippi. David sang in the choir at Mount Salem Methodist Church at talent shows at any venue that would have him. His voice, even as a child, had a quality people could not ignore, a rawness that sounded like it came from somewhere much older and much more wounded than a boy from Whynot had any right to be. At 14, David left home. He went to Memphis under the guardianship of a minister named Eddie Bush, ostensibly to pursue the ministry himself. He lasted about a year in that direction before the pull of secular music proved too strong. He joined the Dixie Nightingales, a gospel group, but the boundaries between sacred and profane were already blurring. At 15, he traveled to Hot Springs, Arkansas with jazz musician Phineas Newborn Sr., playing at the 50 Grand Ballroom and Casino. He worked with horses at a jockey club. He sang anywhere that would pay him and some places that would not. By the late 1950s, David had made his way to Detroit following his brother Jimmy and an uncle who were already living there. Detroit in those years was becoming the epicenter of black popular music, and David could feel it. He met Berry Gordy, who was still a songwriter with ambitions of building his own label. David actually helped Gordy's father, a contractor, do construction work on the building that would become Hitsville, USA, the headquarters for what would become Motown Records. He was literally building the house that would make him famous, laying bricks and pouring concrete for a future he could not yet see. He recorded a few unsuccessful singles for small labels Anna Records and Checkmate, neither of which went anywhere. He played drums and sang with a group called the Voice Masters. He was talented, everyone could see that, but talent without a vehicle is just potential, and potential does not pay the rent. Then, at a New Year's Eve party at the end of 1963, David jumped on stage with a struggling vocal group called The Temptations. He spun around, threw the microphone in the air, dropped into a full split, and rose back up without missing a beat. The crowd erupted. The group asked him to join. It was the moment that would change everything. The orphan boy from Whynot, Mississippi, the preacher's son, who never knew his mother, who had been beaten and had wandered from Memphis to Hot Springs to Detroit looking for something he could not name, had finally found his stage. But the demons he carried from that house in Mississippi, the violence, the abandonment, the hunger for love that never seemed to get filled, those came with him too. They always do. When David Ruffin joined the Temptations in January 1964, the group had released several singles and none of them had gone anywhere meaningful. They were talented, well-rehearsed, and going nowhere fast. Ruffin changed that almost immediately. His first recording session with the group was January 9, 1964. For the first year or so, he mostly sang background while Eddie Kendricks and Paul Williams handled the leads. But Smokey Robinson, who was producing and writing most of the group's material at the time, saw something in Ruffin that others had missed. Robinson later described him as a sleeping giant in the group, a voice that was both mellow and capable of explosive power. Robinson set out to write the perfect song for that voice, something Ruffin could belt out, but that was also melodic and sweet. The song was My Girl. Recorded in November 1964 and released the following month, it climbed to number 1 on both the pop and R&B charts by early 1965. It became not just the Temptations' signature song, but one of the most recognizable recordings in the history of American popular music, and it made David Ruffin a star. What followed was one of the most extraordinary runs in Motown history. Between 1965 and 1968, Ruffin led the Temptations through hit after hit. It's growing. Since I Lost My Baby. Ain't Too Proud to Beg. Beauty is only skin deep. I know I'm losing you all I need. I wish it would rain. I could never love another. Every single one reached the top of the R&B charts and cracked the pop top 15. The Temptations became the biggest soul group in the world, and Ruffin was the reason people bought the tickets. On stage, he was electric, tall and impossibly thin, always wearing his trademark thick-rimmed black glasses. Ruffin had a physical vocabulary that set him apart from every other performer in the business. He would toss the microphone from hand to hand, drop into a split, and rise back up without breaking the vocal line. He invented a 4-headed microphone stand that became one of the group's visual trademarks alongside the synchronized Temptation Walk choreographed by Charlie Atkins. The Temptations appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, American Bandstand, and in 1968 shared a television special with the Supremes. They were Motown royalty. But success was doing something to David Ruffin that no one around him fully understood at the time. The boy who had never felt loved enough, who had lost his mother before he could remember her face and been beaten by his father for the smallest infractions, now had the adoration of millions. And it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. He began demanding that the group change its name to David Ruffin and the Temptations, pointing to the precedent set by Diana Ross and the Supremes. He started traveling separately from the other members in a limousine that, according to some accounts, was lined with mink upholstery and had his trademark glasses painted on the door. His ex-wife, Jenna Sapia Ruffin, later offered a more modest version of events, claiming the car simply had mats on the floor cut from an old coat. Regardless of the upholstery, the message was clear. David Ruffin believed he was the Temptations, and the other 4 members disagreed. The cocaine had started by 1967 at the latest. He entered a drug treatment program that year, his first, though it would be far from his last. The drugs made everything worse: the ego, the paranoia, the violence. He had begun dating Tammy Terrell, the gifted young singer who had joined the Motown roster in 1965. According to accounts confirmed by Terrell's sister Ludi Montgomery in the TV One documentary Unsung, Ruffin became physically abusive. The relationship ended in 1967 after Ruffin struck Terrell in the head with his motorcycle helmet. Reports of more extreme violence involving a hammer or a machete circulated for decades, but were disputed by Terrell's own family. What is not disputed is that Ruffin hurt her. Terrell collapsed on stage later that year due to a brain tumor and died in 1970 at the age of 24. The guilt, if Ruffin felt it, he never publicly expressed. He was also demanding an accounting of the group's finances, one of the first Motown artists to insist on knowing where the money was actually going. This did not endear him to Berry Gordy. He missed rehearsals, he missed performances, he showed up when he wanted to and disappeared when he did not. The end came in June 1968 when Ruffin skipped a Temptations concert in Cleveland to attend a performance by his new girlfriend, Barbara Gail Martin, the daughter of Dean Martin. 5 days later, the other 4 members voted him out. Dennis Edwards, a former member of the Contours, replaced him. Ruffin himself had encouraged Edwards to take the spot, then almost immediately began showing up unannounced at Temptations concerts, walking on stage during his old songs, taking the microphone from Edwards' hands and singing as if he had never left. The group gave him one more chance. He arrived late. They never asked again. By 1968, David Ruffin owned the most distinctive voice in soul music and absolutely nothing else. He was celebrated and utterly lost. Ruffin's first move after being fired was to sue Motown Records, seeking a release from his contract and an accounting of his money. He called his arrangement economic peonage. Motown countersued to keep him from leaving, and the case was eventually settled out of court. The terms required Ruffin to remain with the label as a solo artist and finish out his contract. It was by any measure a terrible position for a man who had just helped generate millions of dollars in revenue for the company. His first solo single, My Whole World Ended the Moment You Left Me, was originally written for the Temptations. Motown delayed its release, which Ruffin interpreted as punishment. When it finally came out in 1969, it reached the top 10 on both the pop and R&B charts. It was a strong debut. It was also misleading. The follow-up recordings went nowhere. Ruffin felt that Motown was deliberately burying his work, funneling its promotional energy toward Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder, while leaving him to fend for himself. Whether this was corporate strategy or personal retribution, the result was the same. David Ruffin, the man whose voice had defined the Temptations, was becoming an afterthought. He did not release another significant hit for 6 years. Walk Away from Love, which came out in late 1975, reached the top 10 and briefly suggested a comeback. 2 follow-up singles, Heavy Love and Everything's Coming Up. Love performed well on the R&B charts, but failed to cross over. After that, the momentum died again. He left Motown for Warner Brothers in 1979, hoping for a fresh start. It was not. The cocaine, meanwhile, had never gone away. It had only gotten worse. And by the early 1980s, the legal consequences were catching up. In 1982, Ruffin was charged with failing to pay more than $310,000 in taxes over 2 years. He was fined $5,000 and sentenced to 6 months at a low-security federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. He served 4 months and was released early for good behavior. For a man who had once ridden in a limousine with his name on the door, doing time in a federal facility for tax evasion, was a humiliation that should have been a wake-up call. It was not. In 1983, Ruffin rejoined the Temptations for a reunion tour. He missed the first 3 shows. The old patterns had not changed, they had simply found a new context. But the tour did lead to something unexpected. Daryl Hall and John Oates, who were genuine fans of the Temptations, invited Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks to perform with them at a concert at the Apollo Theater in New York. The resulting live album, released in 1985, put Ruffin back on a stage that mattered. He and Kendricks also appeared alongside Hall and Oates at the Live Aid concert in Philadelphia that same year, performing before a global audience. It looked for a moment like a second act. But Ruffin could not stay clean long enough to build on it. In 1986, he pleaded no contest to a charge of receiving a stolen Colt .32 caliber handgun and was fined $150. In 1988, he was arrested for possession of crack cocaine. Standing before a judge, Ruffin described himself as penniless, living in a friend's mobile home outside Detroit. This was a man who 2 decades earlier had been one of the most famous performers in America. He went through rehabilitation in 1989 and claimed to have kicked the habit. That same year, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame alongside the other Temptations. He stood on stage at the ceremony and accepted an honor that recognized his genius while his personal life remained in ruins. Then he moved to Philadelphia to live with his girlfriend, Diane Showers, who had first met him as a 14-year-old fan. Philadelphia was far from Detroit, far from the people who had known him longest, far from whatever fragile support system he had left. Showers later said she asked Ruffin's ex-wife and daughters multiple times to have him committed for long-term treatment. They declined. He was about to get one last shot at redemption. It would arrive wrapped in a borrowed limousine, and it would kill him. In 1990, Ruffin teamed up with Eddie Kendricks and Dennis Edwards, his successor in the Temptations, to tour as Ruffin/Kendricks/Edwards, former leads of the Temptations. It was a package deal built entirely on nostalgia, and it worked. Audiences across the country showed up to hear the old songs performed by the original voices. By early 1991, the trio had completed a successful month-long tour of England that grossed nearly $300,000. They played the Sands in Las Vegas and the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. At the time of Ruffin's death, a European tour was already being planned. His personal manager, Bob Redfield, told reporters that Ruffin had a lot to look forward to because they were starting to be in real demand again. For once, the future looked like something other than a dead end. But in Philadelphia, the people closest to Ruffin were watching a different story unfold. Linster Butch Morrell, a friend who owned a small limousine service, remembered watching Ruffin disappear into properties to buy drugs on a regular basis. He later told the Philadelphia Inquirer he was getting high so much. The man was a walking skeleton. There were glimpses of the man underneath the addiction. In 1991, Ruffin called his brother Quincy and suggested they go back to Mississippi together, walk along a lake with their feet in the sand. His niece later recalled he wanted to get back to what life was really all about. It was the kind of thing a person says when they know they're running out of road. Diane Showers saw it too. She told reporters after his death that she had begged his family to intervene to have him committed somewhere for approximately 2 years of treatment. He usually denied he was doing anything at all. On the evening of May 31st, 1991, dressed in bright multicolored Bermuda shorts, white sneakers, and a lime green sports shirt, David Ruffin climbed into a gray limousine belonging to Butch Morrell, driven by a man named Donald Brown. He would never climb out alive. The evening of May 31st, 1991, began unremarkably. David Ruffin spent the earlier hours drinking at a bar in Philadelphia. It was a Friday night, and by most accounts he was in a social mood, not visibly distressed, not saying goodbye. Just a man at a bar, drinking and talking the way he had done hundreds of times before. At some point that evening, Ruffin climbed into the gray stretch limousine that belonged to his friend Butch Morrell. Behind the wheel was Donald Brown, a 35-year-old acquaintance. According to police reports and subsequent news coverage, Brown drove Ruffin through the streets of Philadelphia that night. Where exactly they went and what they did in those intervening hours has never been fully established. What is known is where they ended up. The house was on 52nd Street near Columbia Avenue in West Philadelphia. It was a crack house, one of thousands that had proliferated across American cities during the epidemic that had devastated black communities throughout the 1980s. There was nothing remarkable about it from the outside. Inside, it was a place where people went to smoke cocaine and disappear from the world for a while. Ruffin and Brown arrived sometime after midnight. According to reports published in the Washington Post, Newsweek, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, Ruffin purchased several vials of crack cocaine. Inside the house, he encountered a man named William Nowell. What happened next took less than half an hour. According to police accounts, Ruffin and Nowell split 10 vials of crack cocaine between them. Medical experts later told Newsweek that this was an enormous intake even for someone with a significant tolerance. 10 vials shared between two men consumed in under 30 minutes. For a body that had been abusing cocaine since at least 1967, nearly 24 years, it was the dose that the system could no longer absorb. By approximately 2:25 in the morning on June 1st, the cocaine was gone and David Ruffin was unconscious. What happened in the minutes between Ruffin collapsing and arriving at the hospital remains partially unclear. According to police, Donald Brown somehow got Ruffin out of the crack house and back into the limousine. Whether anyone in the house helped, whether there was a delay, whether anyone considered calling an ambulance instead of loading an unconscious man into the back of a car, none of this has ever been definitively answered. Brown drove the limousine to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. It was shortly before 3 in the morning when the gray stretch limo pulled up to the emergency room entrance. Brown reportedly told hospital staff that his passenger was David Ruffin and that he had overdosed. Then Brown left. He did not stay to answer questions. He did not wait to see if Ruffin would survive. He drove the limousine back to Butch Morrell and disappeared into the night. When hospital attendants reached the back seat of the limousine, they found a tall, gaunt black man slumped unconscious. He was wearing bright Bermuda shorts, white sneakers, and a lime green sports shirt. He carried no wallet, no driver's license, no identification of any kind. In his pockets, they found $53. Emergency room personnel worked on him for nearly an hour. At 3:55 in the morning, David Ruffin was pronounced dead. The official cause would later be determined by the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office as an accidental death caused by an adverse reaction to cocaine. Because he had no identification, his body was released to the medical examiner's office and tagged as a John Doe. The man who had stood on stages before tens of thousands, who had sung lead on one of the most beloved songs in the American songbook, who had been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame just 2 years earlier, was lying in a morgue without a name. It took the FBI running his fingerprints through their database to confirm what Donald Brown had already told the hospital staff. The dead man was David Ruffin. He was 50 years old. The news broke over that weekend and traveled fast. Radio stations across the country began playing Temptation songs in heavy rotation. The headlines, as Ruffin's family would later bitterly note, led with the most sensational details. The Washington Post ran, "David Ruffin collapsed at crack house." The Philadelphia Daily News printed overdose called massive. The coverage treated his death as a cautionary spectacle rather than a human tragedy. Diane Showers, the woman he had lived with for the past 2 years, said she was saddened but not shocked. She told reporters, "He walked in the line of fire." She said they had been considering marriage in January 1992. January 1992 was 7 months away. David Ruffin did not have 7 months. He did not even have 7 hours. The first question everyone asked was about money. David Ruffin had just returned from a month-long tour of England with Eddie Kendricks and Dennis Edwards that had grossed nearly $300,000. One of Ruffin's managers suggested to reporters that the singer could have been carrying as much as $40,000 on his person the night he died. He arrived at the hospital with $53. Somewhere between the bar, the limousine, the crack house, and the emergency room, a small fortune had vanished. Police questioned Donald Brown twice. He was cooperative, according to reports, but his answers did not account for the missing money. Investigators sealed off the crack house on 52nd Street and searched it. They didn't find $40,000. They didn't find a money belt. They didn't find anything that explained where the proceeds from a successful concert tour had gone. Brown was never charged with a crime. No one was. The Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office ruled the death accidental, and from the perspective of law enforcement, the case was effectively closed. Ruffin's family did not accept this. His daughter, Cheryl Ruffin Robinson, told the Philadelphia Inquirer years later that the family had long believed there was foul play involved in her father's death. There were too many unanswered questions about his final hours, too many gaps in the timeline that no one seemed interested in filling. Who was with him in that crack house besides William Nowell? Why did Brown leave the hospital immediately after dropping off a dying man? And where precisely was the money? The family eventually filed a lawsuit. According to court documents referenced in multiple sources, the Ruffin estate alleged negligence and foul play in the circumstances surrounding his death. The case went to trial, and the estate lost. The ruling was upheld on appeal. Whatever happened to David Ruffin's money on the night of May 31st, 1991? The courts determined that no one could be held legally responsible. The media coverage in the days following his death became a source of lasting pain for those who had known and loved him. The Philadelphia Inquirer noted in a 2021 retrospective that the ensuing news coverage treated the details of Ruffin's death salaciously. Headlines about crack houses and overdoses dominated. Very little was written about the music, about the voice, about what David Ruffin had actually meant to American culture. His family felt and continued to feel for decades that his legacy had been reduced to the worst night of his life. This was not an accident of journalism. It was a reflection of how America in 1991 understood addiction, particularly addiction in black communities. When the crack cocaine epidemic surged through the 1980s, the government's response was overwhelmingly punitive. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established mandatory minimum sentences that disproportionately targeted crack cocaine users over powder cocaine users, a distinction that fell along racial lines with devastating precision. Black men who used crack were criminals. White men who used powder were patients. David Ruffin had been both a user and a casualty of this framework. He was arrested for drug possession in 1988 and treated as a criminal. He went through rehabilitation in 1989 and tried to treat himself as a patient. Neither approach saved him. Diane Showers. His girlfriend had seen the end coming. She had asked his ex-wife and daughters to intervene to have him committed to long-term treatment. The request was not granted. Whether this was a failure of the family, a failure of the system, or simply the impossible mathematics of trying to save someone who could not yet save himself, Depends on who is telling the story. Showers later told reporters that Ruffin usually denied he was using it all. Denial, of course, is not a lie that addicts tell other people. It is a lie they tell themselves, and it is the most convincing lie in the world because the person telling it believes it completely. Back in Detroit, the city that had made him famous, hundreds of people visited Swanson Funeral Home over the weekend to pay their respects. A last-minute jam session in Ruffin's memory was held at a club called Orthea's Place in northwest Detroit. Musicians who had known him played with him, watched him destroy himself, gathered to do the only thing musicians know how to do when words fail. They played. Martha Reeves, who had known Ruffin since the early Motown days, said something in the aftermath that cut through all the noise about crack houses and missing money. She told Newsweek that before he died, he should have been aware of how many people loved him. It is a sentence that sounds like a tribute but reads like an indictment, not of Ruffin, but of everyone around him, the industry that profited from his voice, the friends who watched him disappear into drug houses, the system that treated his addiction as a moral failing rather than a medical emergency, the family that could not find a way to force him into treatment, the culture that waited until he was dead to play his songs on the radio and call him a legend. David Ruffin had been loved by millions. He just never knew it in time. The funeral was held on Monday, June 10, 1991, at New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. It lasted 3 hours. More than 1,000 people packed the sanctuary, and thousands more lined the sidewalks outside, some arriving as early as 9 in the morning for the 1 o'clock service. Police were stationed along the block to maintain order. Several people collapsed inside the sweltering church and had to be carried out. Michael Jackson offered to pay for the funeral. According to Ruffin's ex-wife Jenna Sapia Ruffin, Jackson contributed $7,000. Aretha Franklin covered a couple thousand for the printing. The Rhythm and Blues Foundation provided $2,500 for the gravestone. David Ruffin, who had generated millions of dollars in revenue over a career spanning 3 decades, did not have enough money to bury himself. Jackson did not attend the service reportedly to avoid diverting attention from Ruffin. He sent a heart-shaped display of white carnations signed with love from Michael Jackson. Rod Stewart sent flowers with a note that read, "You were a great influence on me. Rest peacefully. Diana Ross." The Spinners and Martha Reeves and the Vandellas all sent arrangements. Stevie Wonder performed an original composition and then spoke directly about the epidemic that had killed his friend. He expressed gratitude for having known the person, the voice, the music of David Ruffin, and he warned the congregation about the destructive power of drugs. Aretha Franklin sang the gospel song, "He Looked Beyond My Faults and Saw My Needs." The Surviving Temptations, Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin and Eddie Kendricks among them, stood together and sang "My Girl." They fought back tears but kept their voices steady. The recessional played to the tune of "The Impossible Dream." Louis Farrakhan delivered a eulogy that contained perhaps the most honest sentence spoken that day. "In David there is a lesson," he said. We should not clap our hands and mourn, for he is out of trouble now. You are still in it." David Ruffin was laid to rest at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit, the city where he had helped build Hitsville, USA with his own hands before building Motown's legacy with his voice. The honors came after, as they always do. Rolling Stone ranked him among the 100 greatest singers of all time, first in 2008 and again in 2023. In 2013, he was inducted into the Rhythm and Blues Music Hall of Fame twice, once as a solo artist and once as a member of the Temptations. In June 2019, the city of Detroit unveiled David Ruffin Avenue as the secondary street name where he had formerly lived. 4 months later, the city of Meridian, Mississippi, near the Whynot community where he was born, ceremonially named a section of 8th Street David Ruffin Boulevard. The boy who had left Mississippi at 14 with nothing had streets named after him in 2 cities. He was not alive to see either one. His influence echoes in places both expected and surprising. Rod Stewart built an entire vocal style on the raspy, emotionally exposed approach that Ruffin pioneered. Marvin Gaye, who openly admired him, channeled similar vulnerability into what's going on. Modern R&B artists, from Raphael Saadiq to Bruno Mars, have cited the Temptations' classic period and Ruffin's voice specifically as foundational to their understanding of what soul music could be. Hip-hop has claimed him too. Grand Puba of Brand Nubian referenced him on the 1990 single All for One. Fall Out Boy nearly named a song after him in 2005 before lawyers intervened. But perhaps the truest measure of David Ruffin's legacy is not in the honors or the street signs, or the name checks in rap verses. It is, in fact, that My Girl still plays at weddings and graduations and barbecues and funerals across America more than 60 years after it was recorded. And when that voice comes through the speakers, people still stop what they are doing and listen. They do not know about the crack house or the missing money or the John Doe tag. They just hear the voice. And for a moment, everything that went wrong falls away, and all that is left is the music. That was always the cruelest part. The music survived. The man did not. Think about that limousine again. A gray stretch pulling up to an emergency room at 3 in the morning. A body in the back seat with no name and $53. Tagged as a John Doe. Fingerprinted by the FBI like a criminal just so the world could be told that one of its greatest singers was dead. David Ruffin was born in a place called Whynot, in a house with no running water, to a father who preached God's love on Sundays and practiced violence the rest of the week. His mother died before he could remember her face. He left home at 14 and spent the rest of his life looking for something to fill the hole she left behind. He found music. He found Motown. He found fame and money and women and cocaine, and none of it was enough because the hole was never really about what was missing from the outside. It was about what had been broken on the inside long before anyone knew his name. He sang My Girl, a song about perfect, uncomplicated love, and he sang it so convincingly that an entire generation believed he knew what that felt like. He did not. He sang, "Ain't Too Proud to Beg." And the truth was, he had been begging his whole life for attention, for recognition, for someone to see the wounded boy behind the famous voice. He sang, "I Wish It Would Rain," and in the end, the storm that came for him was one he had been building since he was a teenager in Memphis, buying his first taste of something that promised to make the pain disappear. Diane Showers said he was considering marriage. His niece said he wanted to go back to Mississippi and walk along a lake with his brother. Butch Morrell said he was a walking skeleton. All three things were true at the same time because that is what addiction does. It lets you dream about the future while it is busy killing your present. He was 50 years old. He had the voice of an angel and the death of a stranger. Rest in peace, David Ruffin.